The main characteristics of Mannerism were the new techniques that were introduced to create depth, movement, and drama. Some of these new techniques were complex compositions, elongated and exaggerated proportions, a new introduction of learning perspective, and unnatural colors. Bright and bold colors that created strong contrasts were used to make intensity, emotion, and tension. Distortion included stretching and elongation of human figures to add an elegant aspect to the artwork, while still making them look dramatic and exaggerated by using unusual poses. The focus on personal ideas and emotions were centered in Mannerism. This personal focus strayed away from realistic and straightforward art that was prominent in the High Renaissance period. The symbolism in these works were usually references to classical literature and mythology to engage in thought behind the allegories and symbols. Finally, complex compositions in Mannerist works often included multiple figures with emphasis to detail to help emphasize the meaning and impact of their artworks. Of these characteristics, the ones that are most commonly seen in El Greco's artwork are the use of elongated figures, unusual poses, exaggerated perspectives, vivid colors, and chiaroscuro. Additionally, although he focused on his personal ideas and emotions that he conveyed in his artwork, he also used elements of reality and fantasy in his artwork. The use of fantasy elements in El Greco's artwork was also related to one of the philosophies of Mannerist artwork. This belief was that art is not real and therefore does not need to inherently become realistic. El Greco was one of the most recognized and influential artists of the Mannerist style that carried his legacy beyond his time. He utilized the techniques he learned from artists that he studied under. His style stood out after the end of the previous High Renaissance period, where idealized perfection was the mainstream. On this side, we can see two different artworks. One is from Pietro Perugino, and one is from El Greco. Perugino's artwork reflects from the High Renaissance period, from when it was made. The composition is clean, the figures are normal, and the poses are anatomically correct. Here is El Greco's work, which reflects the Mannerist period from when this was made. The composition is complex, the figures are all elongated, and the poses are all unusual, also including the stark contrast of the darks and the lights in the chiaroscuro shading. El Greco's artwork shows the emphasis on drama, emotion, and intensity of Mannerism that is not seen in High Renaissance artwork such as Perugino's. Mannerism was a very experimental new style for artists post-High Renaissance.
There are many artists that we study today from the Mannerist movement. A few Mannerist artists that we would like to highlight are Tintoretto, Pontormo, and Bronzino. So Tintoretto was an Italian painter with a Venetian art style born from 1518 to 1594. Tintoretto was known for painting with aggressive brushwork and how his contemporaries would both compliment and critique his painting speed. Due to his artistic vigor, he was actually given the name Tu Furioso, translating to the Furious. His artworks were also recognizable for their strong figures, dramatic movements, and aggressive perspectives, just as we see here in the painting of the Last Supper. As we can tell, it's pretty different from the usual Last Suppers that we would see, which were in one perspective. This one, as I said previously, has a very aggressive perspective instead. There's also Pontormo, who was born with the name Jacopo Carucci, born from 1494 to 1557. He was a Florentine school mannerist painter and portraitist. Through Pontormo's work, we are able to see the significant departure in aesthetics from the Florentine Renaissance's serenity, as it begins to be replaced with a little more intensity in his pieces. Pontormo often used 20 positions along with confusing perspectives, with figures seemingly unaffected by gravity. We can see these characteristics displayed well in his piece titled Joseph with Jacob in Egypt or Joseph in Egypt. Pontormo's work was actually quite unfavorable, resulting in many of his works being damaged and even as far as to being destroyed. However, despite this overwhelming neglect and criticism of his art, recent art historians have been actually giving it more attention and interest. Agnolo di Cosimo, also known as Bronzino, was a Florentine mannerist and painter as well, as he was a close student of Pontormo. Bronzino spent his whole life in Florence, working as a court painter for Cosimo I de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, in his late 30s. Due to his studying under Pontormo, Bronzino's style was heavily influenced by his. Yet there are still some recognizable differences, such as the graceful, slightly elongated figures that were missing in intensity and agitation that was often found in Pontormo's works. Even though Bronzino was mainly a portraitist, he painted various religious and allegorical subjects such as Cupid, Venus, folly, and time. Just like his instructor, Bronzino faced a lot of criticism because of his work's cold and unnatural appearance. However, again like Pontormo, in recent decades, we have seen his art develop more popularity to the public eye. Now, along with these three very famous Mannerist painters, we wanted to touch on one specific one, which is El Greco. Now, El Greco, who was born with the name Dominicus Theotokopoulos, I hope I pronounced right, was a Greek artist born in 1541 in modern Crete and passed away in 1614 in Spain. El Greco trained in Venice under Titian in order to develop and master his colorful Mannerist style, along with later studying works of Michelangelo and Raphael in 1570 in Rome. Eventually, in 1577, El Greco decided to settle down in Toledo, Spain. Here he depicted mostly local religious foundations and was also known to be an accomplished portrait painter. During this time of his career, he also created several versions of his most famous paintings. Through his emotional and vivid art style, El Greco was able to express the passion of Counter-Reformation Spain as well. His painting style was considered to be dramatic and expressionistic, often containing elongated figures that we usually see in Mannerism and dreamlike pigmentation. He was also considered to be a forerunner of Expressionism and Cubism.
As we know, El Greco was a highly influential artist that had a distinctive art style, shaping how society viewed art in the future and being one of the main contributing artists of the Mannerism movement. But how did he get to that point? How did he get so popular, and what about his art specifically was so distinctive in comparison to other artists? Really quickly, we'll review the characteristics of Mannerism. Roughly, there are elaborate techniques, bright and bold colors, chiaroscuro, elongated and distorted figures, expression of emotions and ideas, symbolism, complex compositions, elaborate details and frames, and references to religion, literature, and mythology. And out of these Mannerism movements, El Greco's distinctive characteristics are his dramatic lighting, distorted figures, complex compositions, use of religious and spiritual themes, and emphasis on emotional expression. Other than just his contribution to the Mannerism movement and the characteristics that made Mannerism, he added unique and eccentric elements to the history of art. These elements stem from his Byzantine and Italian art style, as well as his Greek heritage. From his Byzantine and Italian art style, he used Byzantine iconography, gold leaf, drapery, and an emphasis on spirituality. From his Greek heritage, he used expressive, elongated figures, complex compositions, and religious themes. El Greco's most famous artwork is the Burial of the Count of Orgaz, created from 1586 and 1588. This painting depicts the funeral of Count Orgaz, a historical figure from Spain who played a huge role in the church. Looking at the two sections, the top section has elongated figures with exaggerated features to give it that surreal and dreamlike depiction, while the bottom has a more realistic display. On the top half, the color palette is a lot lighter in comparison to the rest of the painting, which is done to show elegance and holiness as he depicts a scene from the heavens. As we see, there are a lot of figures that surround Jesus Christ, who is in the upper middle of the artwork dressed in white, who is identified by the stigmata mark on his ribs. The other figures around him appear to be angels and saints, like Mary, who is to the left of Jesus Christ dressed in red and blue, and Peter, dressed in gold, holding keys. In the middle of the painting below Christ, but to the right of Mary, we see a figure who is duller and a grayer tone. This is the soul of Count Orgaz as he awaits divine judgment. El Greco uses looser brushstrokes to paint the heaven portion of the artwork to give it a more graceful appearance. but still using light contrast to show the transition from earth to heaven as the further you go down, the darker the painting becomes. The bottom half depicts the funeral and entombment of Count Orgaz. It's a darker and sorrowful scene as the lifeless Count Orgaz is surrounded by people who have grief and sorrow depicted on their faces, some even looking up towards the heavenly side, making it look like they are praying. The earth portion of the painting holds more earth tones, with more refined transitions and high color contrast to give this part of the artwork a more moody expression. Two figures that really stand out to us are the two individuals dressed in gold with intricate details along their robes, who are likely the heads of the church. The cluttering of the people that are around Count Orgaz shows a huge contrast from the heaven side as they prepare his physical being for the afterlife. Another artwork of El Greco's that I'm going to refer back to is the opening of the fifth seal. It's another religious painting that was created between 1608 and 1614. It depicts a passage called the Revelation in the Bible, when the fifth seal is opened and the sounds of martyrs cry out to God, receiving robes for doing so. As the artwork shows the martyrs reaching up to the heavens, they are very elongated with exaggerated arms and expressions. It adds drama and intensity to the scene as they appear desperate to be heard as their eyes look up, but their mouths are turned downwards. As some of the martyrs are clothed, the ones in the background appear to be receiving their robes to the point where they haven't even been able to put it on yet, which helps to show the process of receiving the robe, as some are shown receiving it, having it, putting them on, and one of them being fully clothed. El Greco's style for this artwork has a lot of loose brushstrokes and bold colors, emphasizing the importance of these robes and what it means. It's a huge contrast to the earth-toned background, emphasizing its importance as it's a gift from the heavens. Compositionally, it's very linear, as all the figures appear to be aligned towards the middle of the artwork, aside from the figure in blue. They are aligned to show the division of the sky and the earth, as the martyrs are there to divide the two. Three artists that I'll be comparing to his art are Pontormo, Tintoretto, and Bronzino. One main difference between Pontormo and El Greco were their different eras and cultural backgrounds, as El Greco worked in Spain during the 16th to 17th century, whilst Pontormo worked during the High Renaissance in the 16th century. A famous painting of Pontormo's is the Deposition, created between 1526 and 1528. It depicts when Jesus was removed from the cross, as shown by his stigmata. The main focal point of this artwork is Christ, as he lay lifeless surrounded by many figures with sorrowful expressions. One easily identified figure is Mary, as she is seen to the right of Jesus in white clothing, looking at Jesus, who's gone pale. She is depicted as reaching out to her son delicately, which makes me believe that she is letting him go with the feelings of being sad instead of angry. The figures that surround him are either looking at Mary, Christ, or somewhere past the eyes of the viewer. Although this is an emotionally charged scene, it appears elegant and harmonious because of his softer color choice. Comparing El Greco's artwork depicts a more linear composition where he portrays depth by his use of color and contrast. Pontormo creates depth by the overlapping of figures multiple times in his composition, which makes it appear more realistic and natural in comparison to El Greco's. El Greco's color choice is bolder and brighter in comparison to Pontormo's because, although the colors are on the other sides of the color wheel, they appear more pastel-like, which I believe was done to create more harmony with each other and give it that softer look. Whereas El Greco's loud colors are meant to catch your attention and kind of jump out at you. The figures in both artworks, however, are elongated. This adds emphasis and drama to them, which is a common characteristic for Mannerism artwork. Tintoretto. Just like Pontormo, Tintoretto and El Greco came from different cultural backgrounds, as Tintoretto was born in Venice and worked primarily in Italy, whereas El Greco was born in Greece and worked primarily in Spain. However, unlike Pontormo, they were both artists during the same era. Although El Greco and Tintoretto were known for their use of religion, history, and mythology as their main subjects, they both had different styles in the way they portrayed each category. For example, El Greco mainly used religious subjects, but he was more surrealistic and spiritual in his work, whereas Tintoretto depicted his historical and mythological subjects as more naturalistic and narrative-driven. The Last Supper by Tintoretto, created between 1592 and 1594, depicts the iconic scene of Jesus Christ and his apostles before his crucifixion. What's so interesting about this artwork, though, is the point of view and perspective of the scene. Normally, we see the Last Supper as a one-point perspective, but this one is different. The table is placed at an angle and we appear to be looking down from the corner of the room. Additionally, the background is darker and more cosmic than the original. Instead of being an open, bright room with symmetric columns in the background, there are darker columns behind him that emphasize the halo around Jesus' head. This adds drama and suspense to the scene. In every Last Supper artwork, there is always good old Judah. However, in this artwork, it's hard to identify him as there are two figures that are near the table without halos. Not only 11 figures, including Christ, there are also only 11 figures that could be apostles, excluding Christ. Comparing the burial of Count of Orgaz from El Greco and the Last Supper by Tintoretto, they are very similar with their use of color, light, composition, and subjects. However, they are just as different. For example, both El Greco and Tintoretto use bolder colors that contrast each other. When in El Greco's, he uses gold to contrast with the other softer colors, whereas Tintoretto uses vibrant colors that contrast with each other as a whole. With this color contrast, they also differ in their use of lighting, even though they both use dramatic lighting skills. Tintoretto uses very dark shadows and very light highlights, giving it that suspenseful aesthetic. However, El Greco uses the darks and the lights to separate two scenes in the same artwork. It adds to the emotional contrast of the two. Compositionally, Tintoretto used a sharp angle as his perspective for the Last Supper that gives the iconic artwork new dimensions and the elements that make it more mysterious than the original. In comparison to El Greco, his artwork is more linear with a rounder composition at the top. However, it is a one-point perspective and it gives it symmetry, whereas Tintoretto's is meant to be skewed looking, but also balanced. Lastly, there are both religious scenes that are emotionally charged. Tintoretto's artwork is very suspenseful, dramatic, and full of mystery, whilst El Greco's is more sorrowful, but balanced with peace. Just like Pontormo, Bronzino was an artist of a different era and cultural background. Bronzino was a Florentine artist during the 16th century. In comparison to El Greco, Bronzino had a more refined and mature aesthetic to his artwork, whereas El Greco's main emphasis was emotions and spirituality. For example, in Bronzino's An Allegory with Venus and Cupid, we see this painting that is beautiful upon first glance, but the further we dive into the meaning of it all, it becomes darker. The details he placed in the background that tells a story is what gives his artwork so much meaning. As a focal point of the painting, we see two nude figures who are held in an embrace. This woman is identified as Venus due to the golden apple in her left hand and an arrow in her right. We believe Cupid is to her right, as his wings and arrows are indicators that he is the son of Venus and the god of love. The two appear to be ignoring what is going on in the background, as there are figures who seem to be in distress or suspicious looking, with the contrast of the lighting of Venus and Cupid and the background. Researching about this painting, the background of the painting represents darker, more deceitful love, and according to a Visual Arts website, the new child, Pleasure, shows Venus and Cupid with rose petals oblivious to the pain of love from the thorn that pierces his right foot. Behind him, a creature, Deceit, with the head of a girl but the body of a beast, offers Venus a sweet honeycomb with one hand while hiding the sting in her tail with the other. Meanwhile, behind Cupid is a dark, screaming figure who symbolizes either jealousy or perhaps the effect of syphilis, which had reached epidemic proportions by the mid-16th century. The figure in the top left of the picture represents Oblivion, trying to draw a veil over the events below. However, she is stopped from doing so by the balding man, Time, with the hourglass on his back, an allusion perhaps to be the fatal long-term effects of syphilis, or simply to the transience of all physical pleasure. That being said, comparing this artwork to El Greco's opening of the fifth seal, An Allegory with Venus and Cupid, has more refined and smooth textures on the figures. In Bronzino's artwork, the transitions of color and natural color choices give the artwork a more realistic look, whereas El Greco's opening of the fifth seal has bolder colors that aren't supposed to make the art look realistic in the slightest. His aim was to make his art surreal and dreamlike, which gives his art a more dramatic and expressive look. Looking at the figures in the artwork, both artists elongated the figures in their paintings. This was done for two different reasons. El Greco's was to emphasize the perspective and expression of the figures as they reach up to the sky, but Bronzino's was done to give the figures a more graceful appearance, emphasizing their expression of affection. Compositionally, El Greco's art is linear, with the majority of the figures aligning near the bottom half of the artwork, as a dark sky in the background and of the upper half. However, in Bronzino's artwork, the background is full of figures that clutter and surround Venus and Cupid in the middle, which was done to make you feel like Venus and Cupid are being almost suffocated, but are unbothered. The two subjects are more similar than you'd think. Although one represents love with the potential for it to be manipulative, the other represents sacrifice for faith. Both show the contradictions of human emotions and feelings.
El Greco's impact and influence in the art world. As a result of El Greco's unique style of art, he has since impacted and influenced some well-known artists. In the academic journal El Greco of Toledo, Edward Sullivan writes, Edward Manet used at least one painting by El Greco as a model for one of his own works, called The Dead Christ with Angels. Pablo Picasso has also been known to be inspired by El Greco's style of saturated colors and elongated figures all throughout his career. Most of these characteristics are visibly apparent during his Blue period. According to Museo del Prado, Picasso used El Greco's portraits as a basis for introducing references to Spanishness in his art. When we compare Picasso and El Greco's art side by side, we can find significant similarities. While observing Picasso's oil painting, Evocation, The Burial of Casagemas, and El Greco's landscape oil painting, View of Toledo, some similarities include dynamic movement, saturated colors, as well as nearly identical color palettes, with the use of blue and green tertiary colors. They also have an overall similar S-curve composition that leads the viewer's eye all across the paintings. Both El Greco and Picasso's artworks display greenery in the foreground depicting movement, which then lead our eyes up the compositions. Both artworks are also split about 1/3 of the way diagonally, and there is also significant similarities in the movement of the clouds and the forms they take shape. Though El Greco is strictly depicting a landscape of the town he settled in, we can still assume that Picasso was inspired by El Greco with his use of elongated figures. El Greco's artworks are not considered ones of an old master, nor is he considered a household name artist. This could be due to the criticism he faced during his active years as an artist. Nevertheless, his work has influenced other artists, and he took on artistic risks which eventually led to a new generation of artists that could do the same and prosper. Being trained as a Byzantine icon painter during his time as a student influenced his art style during the Mannerist art movement, with his emphasis on the use of saturated color and exaggerated figures. Being a part of the Manneristic art movement, we can conclude that his artworks were fitting during the Counter-Reformation Spain. His art strayed away from the naturalism as this Manneristic art movement found its way in the midst of the Renaissance movement. In addition to his use of bold, saturated colors, he combined these elements with contrasting dark backgrounds, which soon after led up to the Baroque art movement. Further on his Byzantine education, he continued those ethereal characteristics of vivid colors, elongated, exaggerated figures, well into his career. They became a signature of his when describing his expressive art style. His unconventional choice to focus more on expressiveness, color, and movement in his paintings rather than reality or naturalism, to go against the grain of what was the Renaissance movement, only define El Greco's ability to influence some of the most famous artists we know today.